Good evening, everybody. Okay, so we're going to talk about advocating for your child in the school system right across Canada. And unfortunately, this is a very sort of confusing topic because when we're dealing with all of the school systems across Canada, they're all somewhat different. They've all got pros and cons and issues, but we're going to go through the first section tonight to hopefully explain all of that to you. And then in the next session, delve more into how you can specifically advocate. So this is just a disclaimer slide, basically saying not to take this information as medical advice. It's for educational information only. So as I said, tonight we're going to be covering the first 4 topics. Now, this slide deck was designed for ADHD, but I'm told that many of your children also have issues with ADHD and executive functioning. And I will try to change the wording somewhat, but if you've got questions at the end, happy to answer all of those. So special education systems are under provincial mandate, and that's why we have this inconsistency across the country around special education and how kids with special needs are serviced or recognized in the different provinces. So every province or territory has an Education Act, which states that the government has a duty to provide access to education, and it also specifically states that students with disability have rights to equal access to education. The wording's a little different for each province or territory, but basically that's what they say. So special education systems and funding models vary. So as how they recognize kids, but also how funding is provided to those students with exceptional needs. Generally, they're under 2 different systems. One called inclusion, which is not exactly the same as the inclusive classroom, but I'll be explaining that, and one called identification, which I'm going to explain more. So the provinces generally in territories are moving towards systems of inclusion. There's various reasons for that. It is actually the sort of thing right now to have an inclusive classroom, but we also have to remember it's also a way to reduce costs to education systems, to have a system of inclusion if it's not done correctly. Okay, so and how these systems work in each province and territory has a significant impact on students with disabilities in general, and we're going to be going into that. So I'm first going to talk about the inclusion system. So the inclusion system means there's no formal identification required for what the school boards called an exceptional learner, okay? Basically what happens is the Ministry of Education mandates the school boards, who then mandate the principals to meet the needs of students with special education needs. It's not tied to a specific diagnosis, although often that comes into the discussion as well. And as I said, it's not the same as inclusive education. So what is inclusive education generally means that all students, regardless of their strengths, needs, their exceptional needs, are basically taught in a mainstream or community classroom. The provinces and school boards are systematically reducing and getting away from smaller exceptional classrooms for students with special needs or withdrawal, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of talk about a term, which I'm sure you've heard, called universal design, which means it's a method of creating an environment, materials, a way of teaching to a wide variety of students with different physical and mental abilities, so they can all succeed in the same environment. So that is the goal, that is the dream. We are far, far away from that yet, but that's what all of the boards and all of the ministries are talking about. And by the way, last year, I spoke with every ministry of education in every province and every territory across Canada, because we produced a report card. It's a follow-up report card. We did another in 2010 where we graded all of them and as to how they recognized or did not recognize students with ADHD and the difficulties. I'll try to bring that up on the screen later if it works, but we'll see. Okay, so the identification system is where a team or committee decides if a student meets the criteria. Very often it's, although they say it's not tied to a diagnosis, it's supposed to be tied to a level of need. Unfortunately, because the provinces that still use this system have divided the disabilities into categories. And if a certain diagnosis of a student doesn't fit into a particular category, we're in trouble. And we're going to get into that in a minute. So this recognition under a category in Ontario, the process is called IPRC, which stands for Identification Placement Review Committee. Terrible acronym. Nobody can remember it unless you live and breathe this stuff. But that basically is a process that is gone through to officially identify a student. And when a student is identified, the right to special education resources stays with them to the end of their high school career. Post-secondary is a whole nother issue, and we'll deal with that in the second part of the presentation in a few weeks. And also in some provinces, this recognition is tied to funding for the school. So if the child is deemed an exceptional student, funding will flow to the school. But the provinces are more and more moving away from that, and we'll talk about that as well. So these systems have both benefits and drawbacks, right? The negative to both of them is if the school uses what we call a wait to fail approach. So they really need to see the child struggling. Some boards talk about being academically behind for 2 years, all these kind of things. Again, there's no consistency in this, but we frequently have issues if the if the kids are doing okay, they're not failing, but unfortunately we may have very, very bright students who are getting, B's, C's kind of thing. They're not working to potential, but they're not failing. Unfortunately, that makes it more difficult to advocate for them to get special education resources. And as I said, this identification system can also be used to block students with ADHD, but also students who are not recognized under specific categories. And each province has different categories. In Ontario, it's 5 categories. ADHD does not fit under any of them. I don't believe hydrocephalus fits under any of them either. So the struggle to get an IPRC designation is very difficult. You may be able to get an IEP, you may not. Ontario's a mess right now with very little consistency. So the other difficulty with the inclusion system is if there is not direct documentation identifying a student, it's a little harder to secure their rights for special education resources. And IPRC has legal things attached to it, and IEP becomes a legal must. It doesn't mean you don't have to continually advocate, but you've got that documentation there that makes it easier to fight, and your child's rights are actually mandated. Our biggest issue right across Canada, and I'm sure you have exactly the same issue for the students with hydrocephalus, is educators are not trained in the impairments that they will typically see in these kids, and they're also not trained into how to teaching strategies, accommodations, supports that they can put in for these kids. That is our biggest problem. Well, in ADHD, very often the kids are still seen or identified or thought of as being behavioral problems, or especially if they have problems with executive functioning, organization skills, time management, problem solving, all of those things we see in ADHD, and apparently you also see in some of your kids. If teachers do not understand those impairments or difficulties, they frequently think the child is just not trying hard enough, they're lazy, they're not motivated, etc., which is not the case at all. So the systems do have some positive. As I said, identification can secure rights. The inclusion model can lead to services faster because they don't have to go through the system, but it really all depends on the details and how these things are implemented from board to board and school to school, which makes a huge difference. We find that for our students with ADHD, what makes the biggest difference is if the principal gets or has been trained in ADHD, and if the teacher has, because then they will understand it and understand it as a legitimate medical disability. So some of the provinces, and I'll just go over some of this quickly. So systems of identification, Quebec, Ontario, Newfoundland, and Saskatchewan all have systems of identification, but Newfoundland and Saskatchewan recognize ADHD under a category. I do not know how that applies for hydrocephalus. Now, many of them do have categories, medical categories, so you may be able to get it recognized under there. Quebec and Ontario, not so much so. So Ontario doesn't tie funding to the codes. It generally gives chunks of funding to boards, and a portion of that goes to special education, and there is additional funding for kids with severe disabilities. Quebec, again, lack of recognition of a lot of the disorders. So if you're dealing with a child with a disorder that's in a category, much easier. BC is transitioning. BC has been transitioning for literally 5 years now. So, but again, there was a change of government, and then obviously there was COVID. They decided to totally relook at their education system and how they funded it, which meant they totally looked at the special education system. They are moving. They promised me they're still doing this, moving to a system of inclusion, because BC was one of our biggest issues. I mean, Ontario still is, but because they directly tied the funding of the schools to the kids being identified under a category. So the schools were not getting additional funding for kids with impairments that were not recognized under a category. Alberta is mostly transitioned. They're still using some codes to sort of collect data on special education planning per se. There's a link there. ADHD is recognized under a physical or medical disability, under a neurological condition, and I would guess that hydrocephalus would be as well. But again, that's something you can use that link to and look into. The others have systems of inclusion. New Brunswick is a really interesting test case. And actually, in our report card of the provinces of 2010, we actually said that, okay, moving to a system of inclusion, in theory, sounds wonderful. But if it is done, so all of the kids with exceptional needs are put in a regular community classroom, if that is done with not reducing class size, putting in more EAs, training the teachers, all of that support, we're going to have a huge issue. And New Brunswick is a perfect example of that. So they totally moved to the system of inclusion, or to them, it was the inclusive classroom they moved to. They did not put any of those additional supports in. It's called policy 322. They can't even use the term special needs. So basically, a couple of years ago, they started re-looking at this because they were having burnt out teachers, complaints of violent episodes in the class. The parents of kids with special needs were saying their needs weren't met. Even the parents of kids without special needs were complaining. It was a mess. So they said they're not going to move away from the system of inclusion, but they totally have to relook at what they're doing. Some of the other territories and provinces, as they've moved into these systems of inclusion, some of them have had it for a while, some issues have propped up. So Yukon, for example, has removed IEPs, individual education plans, placed all students under what they call SLPs, unless they don't expect that student to graduate high school. The difficulty is IEPs are considered a legal document with legal rights. They need to be implemented, and you can fight for that. SLPs, who knows, right? Nova Scotia has IPPSs, and each province has a different term, right? IPPs, IEPs, ISSPs, there's all kinds of different terms. They all basically mean an individual education plan. They're just different acronyms. So they say they will only implement it if they recognize academic issues. And remember that point I said when, if they're looking for the child to be significantly academically behind, the difficulty is if we have bright students who should be getting all, A's and B's and are not failing, they're not working to their potential, and they have the right to special education resources. Manitoba is actually doing quite well. We didn't have too many issues when we looked at them and graded them. Same with Nunavut, Northwest Territories. And again, the Northwest Territories are only putting IEPs in if there are significant changes to the child, the way the child is taught and learns. Otherwise, they put SSPs in place. And again, we don't know the legal ramifications around SSPs. So BC, I basically said is transitioning. They again are transitioning to a system of inclusion, which means all of the categories are taken away. They have said that ADHD is going to be recognized, but my point to them and my point to the Ministry of Education in BC is, okay, you have had a system in place for several decades where you did not recognize some of the students as having disabilities who were not under your categories. Just by transitioning to a system of inclusion does not mean your teachers are automatically going to change their mindset, because what we find with educators is if that specific disability or diagnosis or whatever you want to call it, sorry, is not under a category, teachers tend to view it as not really being a serious disability or causing many educational exceptional needs. They really kind of don't take it seriously, and hence the teachers aren't trained in appropriate teaching strategies and accommodations for those kids. So our point to BC is, it's all very well and good to simply transition, but you need to give your educators a strong message that all kids with a disability have the human right to have access to equal access to education, and your educators need to be educated on these things. Okay, so in Ontario, we actually, we've done a lot of advocacy around these categories and students not getting recognized under them. And so in 2011, our Ministry of Education came out with a memorandum which basically stated that students with ADHD, and it listed a whole lot of other disorders, but it said that list was not all inclusive. So I'm sure hydrocephalus would fit under that as well. But it basically said the student did not have to fit under a direct category to have the right to get an IPRC. It's supposed to be based on their level of need, right? They need to display a learning need. And it specifically said students don't have to have a learning disability, because that's basically, the schools were basically saying, if the student with ADHD or another disorder that did not fit under category was not diagnosed as having a learning disability, which is a specific impairment, they didn't have a right to the IPRC and an IEP. Now they are putting some IEPs in place for kids, but it's totally inconsistent. So we will have two students, same diagnosis, very, very similar impairments in two different boards within 10 miles of each other, and receiving totally different levels of support, which is crazy, right? But that's where it kind of is right now. So the memorandums has made some of a difference. Some of the school boards have actually taken it to heart. They are IPRCing more kids, but generally school boards don't like to go through this identification process. It's time, it's money, it's more paperwork. It's they basically don't like doing it. I personally feel they also don't like doing it because there is a way to hold them more accountable. Once you have that paperwork, an IEP becomes a legal must. If the student is not IPRC'd, an IEP is totally at a school's discretion to put it in place. But what we also find is also at their discretion to take it away. And we have found some school boards, and some of them actually have policies on this, where they say, if the student is not officially identified, once they get into grade 9, into high school, their IEP is removed. They're taken out, away from special education, put into guidance. And of course, guidance teachers are not trained in these disorders at all, right? So again, we're getting total inconsistency and these kids' human rights not being met. So actually, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and there's links there, and I'm happy for you to get copies of these slides so you can go to these links, but also everything is on our website as well. But they actually wrote a document in 2018 that said, the Ontario Human Rights Commission recognizes, and they specifically said ADHD as a disability because they had been getting so many complaints, but it is also a fabulous document on the rights of students with any disability. So it states education providers have a legal duty to accommodate the disability-related needs of students to the point of undue hardship, which is a pretty strong statement, because if that board doesn't have the resource, they actually have to purchase it from a neighboring board. So it also says the ministry has a legal duty, regardless of whether the student is IPRC'd or fits under those categories or not. And it also states the Ontario Human Rights Code prevails or supersedes any ministry or school board, right? And boards need to follow the guidelines or they open themselves up to litigation. The difficulty is the litigation part, because it is very onerous to go through an Ontario human rights case. To date, they've all been settled in mediation. I was involved in one that went on for a number of years, and they will do everything and anything so it doesn't go to a hearing, because once it goes to a hearing, you can talk about it in the media and it becomes a precedent-setting case. And we don't have one of those yet. So I talked a lot about very little consistency or equity across Ontario, but also from province to province, right? Or in territory, right? And as you can see with this wide variety of systems, how they're implemented, all the different terminology that's used, there is very little consistency. One of the reasons we developed our report card, and after I get to the end of the presentation, I'll stop share and try to share the report card, because that is an excellent resource for you, and it talks about every province. Now, focuses in on ADHD, but a lot of the issues will be exactly the same. So again, little consistency, little training for educators. And since principals are mandated to meet the needs, they also have to be educated about these disabilities, because a lot of times for our kids, the principals and the teacher just see them as disrespectful, or they're not trying hard enough, because they don't understand ADHD, and I'm assuming they don't understand hydrocephalus either. They don't see a learning need, right? They don't see impairments. They see a student who they are interpreting as being a behavior problem, or sometimes they interpret them as not being too bright when maybe the total opposite is the case, right? Okay, we talked about the categories. Oh, and the other issue with this inconsistency is school boards, and really this is right across the country, and we've been directly told this is the issue in Ontario as well. School boards are allowed to sort of set the level of impairment that they see the student as being impaired enough to have the right for special education resources. And that's where we get into big issues, even when trying to get an IEP. And that's what I encourage parents to do, is to develop their child's profile. We have a parenting course, actually, that's going on right now, where I teach parents all about ADHD and the common impairments we see with obviously attention regulation, but executive functioning, self-regulation, emotional regulation, all the things that hit these kids in school, and how to develop an accurate profile for their kids. Because if we are dealing with knowledge on only some of their weaknesses and impairments, and we don't have a very thorough picture, then we are often spinning our wheels and trying to support these kids. So I often encourage parents to collect all of the information that they can, the medical reports, all of that, but also examples of their child's work. Do a log on how long does it take to do homework. Do you have to be with that child and sit with that child to get homework done? You need to have evidence of how they are struggling, and what additional support you're giving them at home, so they're not, quote, failing in the school system. I'm not going to deal with this much, but basically DSM-5 stands for Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's the Bible of the people who deal with any mental health disorders, psychiatric disorders, but also defines learning disabilities and all that. And ADHD used to be under the category of behavior disorder, which when I teach teachers in training about this, I said, open your textbook and what's the title of your chapter? And I said, okay, that is going to imprint that term in your mind for the rest of your teaching career, that kids with ADHD are behavior disorders. So in 2013, it was changed under the neurodevelopmental category, which it should be, and that is also the category where autism and learning disabilities and Tourette's syndrome and any other neurodevelopmental disorder sit. So that was a good thing for us and helped us in our advocacy work. What I find with some parents, and you may have less of this, or I don't know, maybe you guys need to tell me that, but we run into parents quite often who have this fear of labeling. So they don't want to go through the IPRC process. They don't want to share with the school the diagnosis of their child or how their child is struggling, or medical reports, all of those kind of things, because they don't want their child labeled, right? My message to them usually is, if your child is struggling academically, socially, or behaviorally, believe me, they are already labeled in the minds of every educator in that school, every peer in their class, and every parent of their peer. Unfortunately, they're usually labeled with incorrect labels, like, they're stupid, they're lazy, they're bad, etc., etc. So my message to parents is, would you not rather have the correct medical label which will at least start to open the door on advocating for your child. So individual education plans, which I've talked about quite a bit. So that's the list of the different terms that are out there and being used. It all pretty much means the same thing. But know that as parents, you have a right to be involved in developing the individual education plan, right? You have the right to be involved in the placement decision. Actually, it's hard for a school board to put a student in a specific placement decision, either a special class, regular class, whatever, without the parents' input. I mean, a regular class is fine, the student will be there, but if they're suggesting anything else, you have direct rights to have input in that. And you also have rights to, in the developing of the IEP, and I'm going to show you some charts which are specific for ADHD and executive functioning, but I'm sure there is an awful lot of overlap, okay? And my message to parents is, if you're given a copy of an IEP, usually it's sometime in October, if the schools are following the timelines they should be. If you do not like the content in there, or you do not understand what they have listed for teaching strategies and accommodations, very often they'll use 1 or 2 word terms, things like repetition, chunking, all of those kind of things that parents don't necessarily understand, right? Because they're educational terms. Get them to explain it to you. And also, if you understand what they're supposed to be doing or say they're supposed to be doing, you can hold the teacher and the school accountable. Because what I suggest is parents meet every couple of months, take the IEP in and say, okay, so how are these accommodations working? Are they working? Can you give an example of how you have implemented this? If you get kind of a blank stare from the teacher, you know it hasn't been implemented. And we find this a lot. So again, it's your role to call those meetings and advocate for your child to make sure those sometimes beautifully written IEPs that are never implemented, because they're of no use, right, if they're not implemented. So the goal of an IEP is to assist the student or child to be successful at school. It generally lists the child's unique strengths and needs, and you want the teacher to know about your child's strengths as well. If there's specific educational goals, but remember, an IEP should be what we call a living document. So it should be reviewed minimum of once a year, but I really suggest it's reviewed more often than that between the teacher and the parent, and then officially reviewed maybe end of year before it goes to the next year. Because the point of an IEP is that it should be altered regularly and approved upon regularly. And it's moved from one teacher to the teacher next year, so that teacher can understand what are the strategies and accommodations that worked best. So we can start with some strategies and accommodations, what we think will work, but that not necessarily won't work. All our kids are very individualized and they have very individual needs. Well, because of that, the accommodations that will work will also be very individualized. And remember, an IEP is a legal document, so you have the right to demand that it is implemented. So also then IEP will state the placement decision. Is the student going to be in a regular class, have part day withdrawal? Is support going to come into that regular class or float through that regular class? Or are they going to be in a special education class? And the terms they use depends on the province as well. It should always state whether the curriculum is being modified. I'll tell you about that in a minute. It should list the accommodations and if there's any exemptions. Some kids who have significant language issues can be exempted from French sometimes. So what you need to be aware of is the terms. So terms can change from accommodation to adaptation, from province to province or territory. That basically means the environment is changed. So if the child has the accommodation that they can go to a quiet place to write exams, if they have a cubby that they can go to get quiet when they're working, if they sit at the front of the class with the teacher, those are all environmental changes. Also, teaching process. If the teacher is changing how they're working with the child or teaching the child or helping them chunk their work, time manage their work, all that kind of thing, that's, you know, the adaptation of teaching. And then there can be the accommodation or adaptation on how the child is tested, right, or evaluated. So those are the three general terms. Your ears, your red flag needs to pop up if you hear the term modification, which generally means the student is not being taught and the work they're doing is not at their grade level. So the curriculum has been altered and you need to get in there ASAP, figure out what they're modifying. If your child is not working at grade level, is it only specific subjects? Is it all the subjects? Are there, is there modification around the expectations in social skills or self-regulation? You need to find that out because we've had kids sometimes who get into high school, they've been on a modification and they're on tracks not to graduate high school. And parents have no idea, right? So again, you have to pay attention to these terms. Those are the three different accommodations grouping I talked about: instructional, environmental, or assessment. There's a link there that breaks them up and lists all kinds of different instructional accommodations, etc. You can see that on the CADDAC website. So just to finish off, these are some tools we developed and there's links to them there, but I'm going to show you some examples of them. So this is the first page of a document we did on teaching strategies that are typical for ADHD or executive functioning impairments. And you'll see that on the left-hand side. It highlights a particular impairment or weakness or a thing that the student may be struggling with in the classroom. And on the right-hand side, it gives you a list of appropriate teaching strategies and accommodations for that issue. And you'll notice there's a great long list now. This is only page 1. There are 28 different impairments. So this is a multi-page document. You can access it on the website. The links are here on this slide, but they're easy to find on the website. Just look under ADHD information or understanding ADHD general in education, and you'll get all of these documents, links to the memorandum, links to everything is there. So, and the reason that there's such an extensive list, remember I said accommodations are very individual as to what will work and not. So again, we have to choose what's works best and possibly alter it and to tweak it to get, the ultimate IEP. So this is a chart that has actually linked, and the reason we did this is very often schools will question, the legitimacy of ADHD symptoms and diagnosis and all that. So this is all linked medically. There's reasons for this to the DSM symptom that's listed in the DSM. It talks about possible impairments in elementary school and possible accommodations. It's done as a checklist, so you can sit down with your teacher or your medical professional, and even if your child, if they're old enough, and use it sort of as a tip sheet. Obviously, you would change some of the language, but you can say, do you have difficulty staying focused when the teacher's teaching, right? And just get them to describe that to you. It's difficult. Our kids often are not really big sharers, and it may take a number of attempts. But again, these are great to track different things that come up. And then they're also great to help in your input for an IEP. And you have the right to say, my understanding is my child is significantly struggling with this, and this is the accommodation I want you to start with, and then we'll review in 2 months. Okay. Again, we have one for elementary, one for high school, and one for post-secondary. And again, these are numerous page documents. I'm just showing you the first page. So they're a great resource to use. So I'm going to stop there. I just ask that you send it out as a PDF.
Sure.
And all the copyrights are on that. And, I just ask parents that please, everything is under what we call a Creative Commons copyright as well, but
Certainly.
It's for your individual use. Don't kind of share it far and wide kind of thing per se, but especially, people like to review them. Also, there are webinars on a lot of these different topics on the website. So there's one specifically under on executive functioning in detail, and how ADHD impacts kids' learning, and how executive functioning impacts kids' learning, and all. So there's tons of resources on the website, and I think a lot of the information would apply to your children as well.
Absolutely. There's a lot of commonalities for sure. And Hydrocephalus Canada also has resources on navigating the school system that we can forward. All anyone on the session has to do is send us an email, and we can get that out to you. I see a question here, so let me just. Okay, Sally is asking, do you need a psychoeducational assessment if you're on an IEP already with the school?
No, so actually, this is a fight we actually had with universities and colleges across Canada. And again, it's a lot of elementary and high schools think that psychoeducational assessments are sort of the gold standard. They're not. Actually, for ADHD, they are frequently inaccurate. The only reason you would have a psychoeducational assessment done, and by the way, they're usually, or going rate these days are about $4,000, $3,500 to $4,000. is if you have a strong suspicion that your child may have a learning disability along with hydrocephalus or or ADHD or whatever. Psychoeducational assessments, unfortunately, are not accurate for executive functioning. And we find that schools, because they were never designed to be, right? Psychoeducational assessments are primarily to diagnose a learning disability or brain trauma. So again, if you are dealing with those two issues, then yes, they are helpful to understand your child's learning profile, their strengths, their needs, where they may be struggling. And if you can get a diagnosis of a learning disability, and again, it sounds ridiculous to want your child to have another disorder, but if they're diagnosed with a learning disability, you may find advocating in the school system easier because the learning disabilities are always recognized under the categories.
Yeah, I know many in our community can access neuropsychological assessments through the Children's Treatment Center if their child has spina bifida and hydrocephalus. And for hydrocephalus, generally speaking, their neurosurgeon can connect them with a psychologist that can also do a neuropsychological assessment if a learning disability is suspected.
So what I would recommend, though, whoever you're looking at for doing the testing, have a discussion with them before. Make sure they understand executive functioning impairments and the impairments that they typically would see with kids, with the diagnosis your kids have, and that they know the appropriate language to advocate in school systems. Because the difficulty is you can have the psychoeducational testing done, it can come back that your child is in the normal level for executive functioning, because these tests are not accurate, even if the child is struggling daily in their executive functioning, we still get them in the normal range because psychoeducational testing is done in the perfect environment. It's one-on-one with a tester. It's a quiet classroom. The child can ask for clarification. The tester can prompt them. That's not a classroom environment, right? Where they're struggling every day. But the schools will then take that report and say, no, their kids in the normal range. We do not have to give them any resources at all. And the language in the report, and actually, I shouldn't be telling you all this because it's actually in the next session, but if the psychologist says the child should have because they have difficulty in this and this, the school can throw in the garbage. But if the wording says it is essential for the student to have X, Y, and Z to be able to access the curriculum, they can't get out of that wording. So it's very important your psychologist, if you're going to pay $4,000 for this, is very knowledgeable on how to write these reports correctly.
Okay, and I do know as well that schools often offer these assessments. Would you recommend going with a school assessment or an outside assessment?
Yes, I wouldn't say often. Generally, there is a 2 to 3 year wait list. They will rank the students as to severity, and then your child may constantly get bumped to the bottom of the line. The other thing is the school does the assessment, they own the report. If you do the assessment, depending on what it says, it's your choice to share it with the school or not, right? So if the report you think is not going to be helpful or detrimental to your child getting what they need in the school system, it's up to you whether you want to share it. If it's the schools, they own it to the end of your child's high school career, and it stays in their student record, and that's it, right? Because they paid for it. So unfortunately, it's really expensive. If you do have some private health care, many psychologists will divide it under the parents and the child, because they do have to spend time with the parents as well, with questionnaires and evaluating all that kind of stuff. And also, if you know when the cutoff is, so most of them change to a new calendar year in December, some plans in September. You can cross those two. So you can do some testing in December and some in January, and then pool 2 years of your private health care, which will help significantly.
Very good tips. Thank you so much, Heidi.
No
So
problem.
I think we'll wrap up tonight's session. Please remember that Heidi will be back on May 5th to continue discussing IEPs and advocating in the school system and much more. So if you enjoyed this session, please don't forget to register for the second part of this webinar series. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Heidi, for your presentation, and we will see you in a couple of weeks.